All right, so thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Tonight's talk is something that's actually very close to my heart. Many of you may know me as a beekeeper and someone that does a lot of beekeeping education, but in actuality, my career in entomology actually started in biological pest control, and that's actually what my PhD was focused on was the utilization of predator and parasitoid insects to control crop pests in Michigan asparagus. So, what we'll be talking about today is what is kind of like an introduction to this field of biological pest control, which is essentially where we're using good organisms to control bad organisms. In crop situations, you can think of it as like you're basically trying to use good insects to control those insects that are eating your crops, and that's essentially what we're after. Biological control is a very, very nature-driven process. There's a lot of work that goes into actually establishing biological controls, and we'll talk about the three strategies that folks use for biological control. Give me just 1 second. I got a few folks popping in here. And so we're going to talk about kind of this in the full scope of what are the insects that we're working with? What do they look like? What are some of the common biological controls that we see in our own landscapes as farmers and gardeners? And then I'll leave you all today with some strategies that you can use to employ biological controls into your own farm or garden, and how you can also draw them in as well through things like lure mechanisms that have been developed specifically for biological controls. So, for those of you that are farmers and gardeners, this is a really interesting talk in the sense that what this talk is really focused on is you starting to understand your landscape better, the players in your landscape, as far as the insects that are concerned, and how you can use those insects to support the outcomes that you want without having to use things like pesticides. And that's really where this focus of this talk is going to be focused on tonight. So I hope you all enjoy what we're going to be diving into tonight. And this is just scratching the surface. So I'll also leave you at the end with a lot of resources that you can look at as far as a couple books that I'll recommend to get more experience with biological controls. And then also some companies that you can utilize to actually purchase biological controls from. There are companies all across the United States and globally that actually produce insects specifically for this purpose, controlling other insects. All right, so let's get started tonight. For those of you that are joining a little late, we're just getting started here. I've got a flurry of folks that are trying to get into the meeting right now, so let's get started here. Okay, so this is the agenda that we're going to look at for tonight. Basically, what we're going to be going over tonight are a few different criteria as far as kind of getting you familiar with, like, we'll start with the basics, like what is an insect? And we'll kind of go into like what are the different types of insects that we look at that are what we consider biological controls. Now, throughout this talk, I'm going to be using two terms interchangeably: biological controls and natural enemies. These are the same thing. Natural enemies are those organisms that feed on other organisms, and biological controls are the same role. So I'm going to be using those names interchangeably throughout this talk. So just know when I say a biological control and a natural enemy, I am talking about the same thing. But we're going to go through what's an insect. We're going to talk about what's a natural enemy or a biological control, something we would consider a biological control agent. We'll talk about their life cycles and what kind of makes them unique in their life cycles. Then we'll go into what do they actually attack. And we'll talk about the difference between a generalist biological control or natural enemy and a specialist natural enemy. And there are very distinct differences between the two. We'll also talk about the roles of these different organisms as immatures and adults, because sometimes the role of a natural enemy, something that's eating something else, those roles change depending on if they're adults or they're immature. Sometimes organisms only feed on other insects during their immature stage and actually don't feed on insects during their mature stage. So we'll talk about those differences. We'll also talk about what they actually eat. We'll talk about how they actually catch and find their prey, and we'll talk about the difference between catching prey and finding prey. And then we'll get into the idea of what is this idea of biological control as an activity. So biological controls are the organisms that we use in biological control programs, but overall, there are strategies that we use in biological control overall how to incorporate these organisms into our own landscapes. And we'll wrap up with that today about what are these methods that we use, these strategies that we use, and then I'll leave you all with several strategies on how you can incorporate this into your own farming operation. In my opinion, and I mean, I've been working in sustainable agriculture a little over 30 years now. I've worked on a lot of different types of farms, conventional farms that are, basically use pesticides to solve all their problems. And then I've worked on many farms that are highly focused on natural control and biological control. And I actually used to work for the largest plug producer in the United States in California. And we were what's called a veriflora producer, meaning that pretty much everything we did pest management wise was sustainable. And we used a lot of natural enemies in that organization. So I've seen both sides of this and have a lot of experience in all of them. And I'm really excited to share all this with you all tonight. So let's start with what's an insect. All right, at the most basic level, an insect is insects overall are some of the most numerous and successful organisms on the planet. At any one time on planet Earth, there is said to be 10 quintillion insects. That's a one with 19 zeros after it. 10 quintillion insects on the planet at any one time. Now, if the measure of success of an organism is how many individuals you have living at one time on planet Earth, these organisms are highly successful and way more successful than humans as an organism overall, and can withstand a lot of crazy things like, oh, I don't know, catastrophes like asteroids hitting the earth, and insects are still able to survive those. You think of that, things like cockroaches that really haven't changed over billions of years. The same thing with dragonflies. They have not really changed in billions of years because of they're so well evolved as an organism. So very successful, these organisms. And when we think about an insect, what are some of the key characteristics that we see in insects? Well, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, a body that's divided into three segments, antennae, and then most of the time, especially when we're talking about adult insects, most of them have the ability to fly. Now, there are exceptions to all of this. This is a very general rule just to kind of get us rolling today, but that's kind of what you see in a general body plan of an insect. Now, there are good and bad insects out there. And many of you probably are farmers, gardeners. We all love growing tomatoes. And an example of a bad insect would be a tomato hornworm that's coming to eat your tomato plants and, are devastating organisms, big caterpillars that can mow down plants very quickly because of their size. But because of the way that evolution has worked between plants and insects, there are insects that feed on the plants, but then there are also insects that control those crop pests. And that's what we call natural enemies, are these organisms that are actually out there to eat other organisms and are eating the organisms that we want them to eat, like these tomato hornworms. So that's really what a natural enemy is this kind of good organism that is out there in the landscape that's controlling your bad organisms. And this is from our perspective, from human perspective. So if we're talking about different organisms and how insects align with those organisms, it would be a different relationship. But for us as crop producers that are reliant on crops for food, these pest organisms are what we're trying to combat in these farmscapes, and these good organisms are what we're trying to encourage. So let's talk about what is a natural enemy. So there are two classifications of natural enemies. There are predator enemies and parasitoids. Now, predators are something that probably all of us are very familiar with. This is an example of a predator, what you see pictured here. This is a ladybug, and that ladybug right here is feeding on an aphid. And that is a very, very well-known predator of aphids are ladybugs. And I'm sure many of you have seen these for sale in your garden stores, those types of things available for you to release as a predator. Now, predators are unique in the sense that they eat one item at a time. So they move up to a prey item, they feed on that prey item. Once they're done feeding on that prey item, they move to the next one. And that's the relationship a predator has with its prey. Now, parasitoids are very different. And parasitoids are things that most of us that are not in the entomological world are not very familiar with. This is an example of a parasitoid. This is a wasp. And most of your parasitoids are going to be either flies or wasps. And these are very small for the most part. There are larger parasitoids, but for the most part, these are going to be very small organisms that oftentimes can't really even be seen well with the naked eye if you wear glasses like myself because they're so small. But the difference between a predator and a parasitoid is that a parasitoid can feed on many different organisms at the same time because it's not the adult stage or it's not that one individual that's feeding on prey items individually, but rather the parasitoid strategy is that what it's doing in this picture and why you probably think this looks so weird is that this is a wasp that has extended its abdomen is actually laying an egg inside of that aphid. And we'll talk about what happens after this, but essentially the short version is that that egg hatches, it feeds on the inside of the aphid, and then hatches from the aphid as an adult wasp. Now, the reason that this is important to understand is because when we're talking about natural enemies, again, predators are feeding on one prey item at a time, whereas parasitoids will lay thousands of eggs in thousands of prey items very readily and actually give you a lot more control in some situations than a predator would. So it's important to understand those different roles. Some of our really prominent predators that you're going to be seeing in your landscape. And I invite you all, when it comes to the next farming season, to plop your butt down in the middle of your crops and just watch. Part of my PhD, I spent 5 years in asparagus, and part of that was hours of just observation, of just watching insects interact with one another on plants. And you will be fascinated to see these predator-prey interactions happening right in front of you. And these are mainly, when it comes to the predators, these are some of your key ones, especially in the United States, that you look for. So, like these top left or top left three, or excuse me, four segments that you see here, these are all lady beetles, and these are all different types of lady beetles. And there are lots of different types of lady beetles out there. All of us have probably seen this, especially in the adult stage. And we'll talk about what it looks like in the immature stage, which is very different. Carabid beetles, things like this beetle down here. These are ground dwelling beetles. They're ground beetles is what they're also known as. Some of these are seed predators as well. So not only do they predate on other insects, some of them will actually eat your seeds that you're planting in the ground. So sometimes they're not always good. Some are good, some are bad, and they may be of the same classification. So like carabid beetles, some of them are good, some of them are bad. It just depends on the species that you're working with. Soldier bugs here, like you see, this is the goldenrod soldier bug here. We have big-eyed bugs up here. These are really small bugs that feed on other insects. Damsel bugs right here. This is a very common native predator here to the United States. Stink bugs. There are good stink bugs and there are bad stink bugs. Many of you are probably familiar with brown marmorated stink bug, which is an herbivore and actually is a terrible invasive pest. But we actually have spine soldier bugs that are also stink bugs that look exactly the same as them with a few minor differences that are good bugs that actually are feeding on other insects. Then you have things like lacewings. This is a lacewing larva down here, or immature here, down at the bottom, and you can see that it is a crazy looking organism with these really big jaws on it. You have things like maggots. This is actually a fly here. This is a syrphid fly larva here that is something that's a well-known as a predator of aphids. And then we've also got this whole classification of arachnids, and we're not even talking about insects at that point. We're talking about a whole classification of arachnids, everything from tetragnathed spiders to daddy longlegs, and all sorts of spiders in between. And we all notice and recognize spiders as something that readily eat all sorts of different organisms. So that's something to keep in mind as well, as those would be considered predators as well. Again, keeping in mind what is the classification of a predator. It's eating one prey item at a time. So that's what all of these organisms are doing. They're eating one prey item at a time as they come across it. Parasitoids, very different. Most of the parasitoids, a huge portion of them, like I said, are very small and some even really difficult to see with the naked eye. Trichogramma wasps are an example of that. This is a egg wasp that is actually attacking eggs and parasitizes eggs. You can see this is a whole clutch of eggs that have been parasitized and actually have wasps hatching out of them. This here is a tachinid fly. This is another parasitoid as well. These are very large flies, super hairy, really dark, thick hairs on them. Bee flies would be another example of a predator. And then you have these wasps, which are braconid and ichneummonid wasps. These are wasps that you tend to see. A lot of the ichneummonid wasps are bigger wasps, and we actually in Michigan have some that are, a couple inches in length. The big characteristic that you see a lot with these braconid and ichneummonid wasps are these long ovipositors on them. You may think that that's a stinger. That's actually not a stinger. Those ovipositors on parasitoid insects that are evolved to actually attack organisms that are inside of trees. So things like beetle larvae that are feeding on trees. These wasps has this amazing ability with this ovipositor to actually drill into solid wood and find these organisms within wood and be able to lay eggs in them without ever interfacing them, big chunks of wood in between the organism that's parasitizing and the organism it is actually laying an egg in. It's an incredible feat, and these ovipositors are incredibly strong. And so that's when you see these types of wasps with these long, what look like stingers on them, they're actually ovipositors. And those are typically your good, beneficial, natural enemies that are out there attacking pests that are attacking things like trees and things like that. So very different in the sense that of what they are. And like I said earlier, your primary parasitoids are going to be wasps and flies. Whereas the other organisms, our predators, are varied greatly across what genus and families they belong to. All right, so let's look at the life cycles of these two types of organisms, both parasitoids and predators. It's important to know what your life cycles are like because when it comes to developing strategies for how you're going to incorporate this on your farm, you need to know who are going to be the ones that are most relevant for what I'm trying to do, and life cycles have a lot to do with that. So let's start with our predator life cycles. Predators have two different strategies when it comes to life cycles. This is the first one, and this is what we would call incomplete metamorphosis from high school science class, right? Or we call this hemimetabolous as well. What we have here is we start in the egg stage. So we have this predator that's an egg. The predator hatches, and when it hatches as a nymph. And oops, excuse me. And the nymphs will go through several different stages. Boy, that keeps kicking me back. The nymphs will go through several different stages that look a lot like the adult. So if you look at these three nymph stages, you see it's getting bigger, but it's not really changing shape very much. And once it gets to the adult stage, it still looks pretty much the same. The big difference here is that once it goes from that last nymph stage to the adult stage, it gains wings. So the nymphal stages can't fly, but the adult stage can. And that's very typical of a hemimetabolous predator. But predators that are hemimetabolous, what the things that you're going to look for in those particular organisms, give me 1 second, we've got folks still coming in here. What you're going to look for in those organisms when you're looking at them from kind of the standpoint of like, okay, so is this the same as this adult is the closeness to the similarities in how they look. So for example, this is a damsel bug here. This is a really great predator that we have all over the United States. This is one of the nymph stages, and you see there's no wings here, but for the most part, this looks like the same insect. The only difference at the adult stage is it gained wings. Now, this can be a little misleading because sometimes coloration changes in immature insects. So down here below, this is the nymphal stage of the spine soldier bug, which is the predatory stink bug that I spoke about earlier. It looks very different than the adult. The nymphal stages go through this same look. They change colors in each stage, and then eventually will end up as this adult. So sometimes it can be a little misleading when you're looking at immatures and adults. This really gets into kind of the idea of if this is a strategy that you're really focused on, like if you're an organic farmer or a regenerative farmer that's looking for non-chemical driven ways to control pests, this is not something you're just going to learn overnight. There's going to be a lot of studying that goes along with this and a lot of understanding and identifying insects, which is, if you're an entomologist like me, that's where all the fun is. But if you're not, it may not be as fun as you think. But you are going to have to train yourself and understand the identification of a lot of these different insects, which is going to take time and effort. But again, I'm going to show you some resources here at the end to support that. So this second strategy for life cycles is for predators is complete metamorphosis, or holometabolis is what we would call that. This also starts in the egg stage, but the larval stages, you notice that I'm using the term larva instead of nymph. The larval stages of a predator that uses this life cycle, the larval stage is going to look very different than the adult stage. In the example here, this is a convergent lady beetle. This is our native lady beetle in the United States. This is the larval stage, and that's the adult stage. And then this is the pupal stage right here. So it goes from an egg to a larva, then it goes through a quiet period where it pupates and comes out as a completely different looking organism than it started. Many of you may not have realized when you're looking at your crops and you see these little alligator looking things on your plants, you may not have realized that that's actually the larval stage of ladybugs. And all ladybugs look like this. The coloration is just different on them. So if you see these guys in your landscape, or even these right here underneath your leaves or on your plants, those are good insects. You don't want to mess with those. You want to leave those alone. And that's where the identification and starting to train yourself and starting to read books around identification of these organisms is really important, because a lot of times we don't recognize these as valid predators or natural enemies because we don't know the identity of them based on what we're looking at. To kind of ram this home, lady beetles again. Lady beetles are always going to look like this little alligator look shaped thing in the larval stage. They are predatory in this stage as well. So you want to keep them around. You want these around. But they also have that predators. They're also predatory, meaning they eat other insects in the adult stage as well. Lacewings would be another example of a complete organism that goes through the complete metamorphosis, meaning starts very different than it ends. And you can see this is what the lacewing looks like as an adult. There's brown and green lacewings that we have out there, but this is what they look like as an immature. And again, very different looking. You see those big sickle-shaped mouth parts on that organism. That is a nasty looking bug. If you come across it, granted they're pretty small, but that's a pretty gnarly looking mouthpiece they've got there when it comes to a predator. And so these look very different when you look at the two of them. Now, parasitoids, when we talk about life cycles of parasitoids, this is even more different. Now, all parasitoids go through complete metamorphosis, meaning they start as an egg, they go through a larval stages, they go to pupae, where they pupate and completely change into another organism. The larval, so we start here with parasitoids with an adult, and the adult will lay an egg inside of a pupa or in a larva or something like that of another organism of a crop pest. That then that egg hatches inside of that crop pest. It feeds on the inside of the crop pest and basically guts it out, and then it emerges as an adult after it pupates inside of the host. Sometimes they pupate outside of the host as well. So very different strategy. Parasitoids, their immature life cycles happen usually on or inside of another organism, whereas predators, that is not the case. Predators are out roaming around. So very different in the sense of what they do as far as their life cycles are concerned. The other thing that's very different about parasitoids is they have two different strategies when it comes to how many eggs they will lay in an organism. We call this gregarious or solitary. Gregarious parasitoids will lay hundreds of eggs inside of an organism. And this is a prime example here on the left. This is a tomato hornworm, and all of those white casings you see on the outside of that thing are pupating, or they're basically pupa that are out there on the outside. And you see this close-up picture on the bottom, that's the wasp that's hatching out of it. Now, that larva is dead at this point. It has been completely eaten out from the inside and is just sitting there at this point. So it's a dead organism. The other strategy is solitary, and as you can probably guess, what that means is that each wasp only lays one egg inside of that organism. And oftentimes these are very tiny. So when you look at like the tomato hornworm on the left, that's a big larva. That's a big caterpillar that they can load up eggs in. The one on the right, we're looking at an organism that is much smaller. So maybe like a white fly. And in that situation, there's really only room for one organism in that host. So a couple different strategies that they use. It just depends on what crop pest they're going after and essentially what organism they are when it comes to that. Now, when I do this talk live, this is usually the time where I'm hoping I had speaking slot that's after lunch, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to share two videos with you. These are parasitoids in action. These videos, the first one here is going to show you how quickly this process happens of a parasitoid actually laying eggs in a larva. So what I'm going to train your eyes to here before I start the video is this is our parasitoid right here. This is our hornworm that it's on. And I want you to pay attention to how quickly it is depositing eggs. It's literally turning, it's going to turn its abdomen in and punch an egg right into this thing very quickly. So let's watch this. You see eggs being laid there. Every time that abdomen is touching that hornworm, like right there, those are eggs being deposited into that hornworm. Now, over time, those eggs hatch and it starts feeding. And what you'll see is these organisms start to slow down tremendously. And this, after 17 days here, what you see emerging are the larvae that are now going to pupate on the outside of that organism. That thing is dead at this point. But what's happened is that it has essentially been fed on that entire time. Now, before I move on to the next video, I want to bring up just a note here. Now, when you're thinking about how quickly these controls happen, the difference between biological control as a pest management strategy and utilization of pesticides. Biological control is not an immediate process. It is something that you incorporate at the beginning of the season and you foster all season long. And we'll talk about how you do that. Pesticides are what you use when you have no other options, right? This is part of integrated pest management. So pesticides are what you use if your crops are just completely loaded with organisms and are dying, in front of you, and you're literally just losing money every day those pests are out there because of how infested you are. In those situations, the last ditch effort would be a pesticide, right? We're trying to avoid that. And so biological control is something that you work on year after year after year after year through really good stewardship of the land and of selection of crops. And again, we'll talk about these strategies at the end. But I don't want you to get in the idea that if I have a crop that I am losing because it's so infested, biological controls are not the avenue that's going to solve that problem for you. This is more of a proactive strategy. So I just want to put that out there real quick. This is the next one, and this is one of my favorite videos I have ever pulled for a talk, and you'll see why, because it's going to give you the inside view of what's actually happening with this organism.
Our parasitized caterpillar has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fat. The glomerata wasp larvae lie just under its skin.
So this is a parasitized caterpillar. It's already been parasitized. We're on the inside now, and
Each
this is
is
a
the size
parasitic
of a grain
wasp
of
larva
rice,
you see that's eating
but
the
together
inside.
they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight. The caterpillar's thick skin should be a solid barrier to the parasitic wasp larvae. But as their bodies have grown, they have developed tiny, saw-like teeth. These jagged jaws are for one job only: cutting their way out. Stroke by stroke, the larvae slice through the tough layers of skin.
Keep in mind, this caterpillar is still alive when this is happening.
At the same time, they release chemicals that paralyze the caterpillar. As the larvae break through, there is nothing it can do. Free at last.
So if this were after lunch at a conference, you all would be appreciating me now for this graphic video I've just showed you of a caterpillar literally being eaten alive by parasitic wasp larvae. This is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the utilization of natural enemies to employ as a biological control strategy. Is this exactly? You're relying on the natural enemies of an organism to control them, and this is a big prime example of that happening. All right, so let's
Our
move on to our next section, which is what do natural enemies attack? And we're going to talk about the difference between specialists and generalists. So the first one that we're going to talk about are generalists. Now, generalists, when you think about the names, right? Generalist versus specialist, it's pretty easy to understand. Basically, a generalist is something that attacks a broad range of pests. So we're going to use asparagus as the example crop because I spent 5 years of my life studying asparagus natural enemies. And so what we're talking about here in this situation is we have a lady beetle that we have in our crop, asparagus, and it is feeding on several different crop pests because of its feeding habits. It doesn't have a specialization. It feeds on things like aphids or two-spotted spider mite or cutworms or thrips. And so by incorporating a biological control like this into your landscape, this actually is going to give you a broad range of things that this feeds upon. So that might be something that you're looking for when you're thinking about employing these strategies into your own landscape is, do I need something that's going to control a broad range of pests? Or do I need something to control a specific pest because I have something that is just really tearing apart my crops and I need a targeted approach to that? When we're talking about a targeted approach, that's when we're talking about specialists, something that feeds on only maybe one or two different things, very few different prey items. Now, generalists tend to be predators, just as a general rule. Most generalists are predators. Most of your specialists are going to be parasitoids, meaning those parasitic wasps and flies. So in this situation, we've got this parasitic wasp here, and the only thing it attacks in asparagus are the asparagus beetles, both the spotted asparagus beetle and the common asparagus beetle. It will not attack anything else. And so if you were to say, for example, be trying to develop a strategy to control this one pest, maybe a parasitoid that's specialized on that might be the approach that you want to take. But again, if you're dealing with many different pests like aphids and thrips and whiteflies and all of these other things, maybe you want to go with a more generalist approach to that with a generalist insect. So just a little bit different between the two. Now, let's talk about the immature versus adult thing here when we're talking about what do natural enemies actually attack. And there is a big difference here. So some natural enemies, like the wasp that we saw in the video that was basically growing inside of that caterpillar, that is an immature stage that's feeding on that, right? So we talked about the immature stages being larval stages of the parasitoid. That's what's feeding on this organism. It's not the adult stage that's feeding on this organism. The adult's laying the egg in it, but the immature stage is what's actually feeding on the organism and giving us the control. So I guess the question then becomes is what are the adults doing? If the immatures are the ones that are primarily feeding on this, and this goes for not only predators but also parasitoids, a lot of parasitoids, but sometimes the adult actually is not the item that's actually giving us control of the pest. A prime example of this in our parasitic wasps is that most parasitic wasps that in their adult stage, they are flower feeders. They feed on nectar and pollen just like honeybees or bumblebees do. They actually really have to have this in a landscape in order to even be present because pollen is the protein substance a lot of times that they need to keep going in this situation, and nectar as a carbohydrate is very important to them. So if you want to have lots of these parasitic wasps around to control crop pests, one of the simplest things you can do is just plant a ton of flowering plants, which will absolutely help these organisms flourish. But they are not controlling anything in this adult stage. They're merely laying eggs in the larval stages, who's doing all the work. This also is true for some predators. And we talked about the lacewing earlier, right? So the green lacewing here that we see here, in the immature stage, it's this gnarly looking predator with these big old mouth parts coming off of it. And those sickle mouth parts, what they do is they hook onto a prey item, they inject digestive fluid into them, and then they suck it all right back out. So very effective predator. But in the adult stage, and you see this close up of the face here, The adult doesn't even have mouth parts that it can use to feed on other organisms. So again, it does not feed on anything in the adult stage. It's the immature stage that is actually doing the work. The same goes for syrphid flies. And I know many of you are very familiar with this, especially those of you that work with bees as well. These are bee mimics, syrphid flies. And syrphid flies are incredible predators in the larval stage. In the adult stage, they're flower feeders again. So knowing that these organisms that we're trying to encourage on our landscapes are really reliant on flowers, really reliant on flowers, not just as a food source, but when we also think about natural enemies, predators, and parasitoids, they also need places to hide. And diverse flower strips are really great places for these organisms to hide, lay eggs, proliferate. And if you give them a food source like flowers, they're going to do even better. So, this is kind of that difference between that immature and adult stage and what you can actually expect from them as organisms. Now, how do these natural enemies eat? So there's two different ways that these organisms eat. Some of them have mandibles and are chewing organisms. Others are piercing, sucking organisms. And well, the difference here is like mandibles, you could chew up a hamburger. Piercing, sucking, you're not going to eat that hamburger. You're going to basically suck up fluids through kind of like a straw, and we call that a proboscis. So you have this thing here, and you can chew lots of big things here, but you can't chew those big things there. So let's look at some of the insects that employ these different types of mouth parts. So our chewing insects tend to be like the bigger predators. So things like lady beetles in both the adult and the immature stage. Praying mantis, those are a really great example of a chewing insect. Big mandibles, they can chew through lots of things. Carabid beetles would be another example of something that's using a mandible to literally macerate and chew up an insect. And for those of you that don't remember from high school science, insects are different than humans in the fact that insects carry their skeleton on the outside, their exoskeletons. And so those outsides are very hard, things to pierce. And so you've got to have some really strong mandibles to be able to break up those chitinous outsides of those insects. Now, the piercing sucking strategy is one in which they use digestive fluids to kind of liquefy things and then suck things out. And this would be things like our spine soldier bug up here at the top. This is a minute pirate bug here. We've got our damsel bugs and then our big-eyed bugs as well, which all use piercing sucking mouth parts to basically penetrate into an organism and then suck the insides out. Another strategy for killing things. All right, now I'm going to show you a couple slides here of things I just wanted to point out because one of the things that I do when I do this as a live kind of 4-hour workshop is that we do an identification portion of it. And the easiest two organisms to identify if they've been parasitized or not, because you saw like with those caterpillars, you may not be able to tell if they've actually been parasitized or not, meaning that they're actually being fed upon because it's all happening on the inside. But with some organisms, you can tell what your parasitoid population is kind of like based on a few things. And aphids are a prime example. So, because all of us are going to be dealing with aphids, I don't care what crop you're growing, aphids eat everything. Let's look at how you can tell if an aphid has been parasitized just by looking at it. So let's start with identification of an aphid. This is an aphid right here. One of the ways that you can tell an aphid is an aphid is it has these conicals at the back end of it, these two kind of like pieces that come off by the back end of it, almost like antennae on the rear end of it. Now, aphids are very small, they're numerous, they tend to be on the undersides of leaves or on stems of plants. And so this picture right here is the underside of a leaf. Now let's train our eyes to this picture real quick. You see, there's young aphids right here, these little guys right here that are bright green, like our close-up over here. And then there's these fatter aphids that are a little darker green. Those are the more mature aphids at this point. So we've got several different life stages here, right? Several different nymphal stages of our aphids. But I want to train you on a couple different things here. So one, you see one over here that's got wings on it. That's an alet. That's an adult aphid that is flying. But over here, you've got these two, we'll call them golden aphids. Now, golden aphids, when you see a golden aphid that's swollen up like that, that is an aphid that has been parasitized. And if you're looking at your crop and you're flipping over leaves and inspecting them and you see mostly golden aphids, that means you have a really good parasitoid population in there. If you don't, it means that you have very little parasitoid population. So this is a real easy way to tell just from flipping over a few leaves what your kind of population of parasitoids is like. Now, what we call that is a mummy. And once they're parasitized and they turn into this kind of golden aphid, that is a mummy. And you see, here's an adult living aphid and one right next to it that's a mummy. Same aphid, but one's parasitized and one's not. And what will end up happening, and if you take a magnifying glass and actually look at some of these golden aphids underneath your leaves with a magnifying glass, what you'll see is you'll see several of them actually that will have holes cut out of the rear end of them. And that's where your parasitoid wasp, the adult, hatched out of. So nice little example when it comes to aphids and being able to identify those. The next ones are whiteflies. Any of you who grow greenhouse crops, probably very familiar with whiteflies. I used to work in the bedding plant industry, and this was like the bane of our existence was whiteflies. Whiteflies are another one that you can tell if they have been parasitized or not. This is the underside of a leaf, and oops, and what you see are white larvae. This is the immature stage of a whitefly. So you see these immature stages here in white. You see the black ones also, and those black ones are parasitized whiteflies. So you can tell that in this picture up here, over half of our whiteflies have been parasitized. That's a really good sign that we've got a nice population of parasitoids, and those are just going to continue to grow because this is an exponential rate. So, one parasitoid will probably lay, dozens to hundreds of eggs. And so this is an exponential growth process if you leave these alone. Now, if you saw this and you thought that you had an infestation of something and you got rid of all of this, then you have lost your natural enemy community as well. So information and understanding these things is really important. And what we'll be talking about and I believe it's going to be in February, we're going to be doing this because we're going to be skipping January for our next lecture. But we're going to be talking about scouting and how you actually can scout for these things and take good notes and start to actually identify who your good guys are, who your bad guys are, and actually employ strategies, holistic strategies, integrated pest management strategies using them. So something to look forward to. But that's a parasitized whitefly. And again, the same situation when you look at it under a magnifying glass, a lot of times you'll see holes in the back end of them, which is evidence that it has been parasitized. So a couple of real easy ways to determine that. Let's talk about now how do these natural enemies catch and find their prey because it's very different depending on who you are. So we're going to talk about predators first, and we're going to talk about their hunting strategies. Predators employ three different hunting strategies: active, sit and wait, and trapping. The active predators that we see in landscapes are typically things like carabid beetles, ground beetles, or tiger beetles, like you see up here at the top. These are organisms that are actively hunting, meaning they are moving around constantly looking for prey items. That is an active hunter. Another example of that would be a lady beetle. Those are active hunters as well. They are constantly moving through plant material trying to find organisms to feed upon. And a lot of these active hunters, most of this is just driven by instinct. They're basically just roaming around trying to find anything they can. You also have syrphid flies down here as well. And then the soldier beetle, the goldenrod soldier beetle as well. These are organisms that are actively moving around on plants looking for prey items. So, just because it's a maggot, like you see in the syrphid fly maggot right here, it's not stationary. It's moving around trying to find aphids to feed upon. So those would be our active hunting strategies as well. Those are hunting on the plant. So with the first set that we looked at, those were hunting on the ground. This is hunting on the plant. The next set that we have are those that hunt in the air. And these would be things like robber flies, things like cicada killers, or things like dragonflies. Dragonflies are my favorite insect of all insects, in addition to the honeybee, but I have a really strong affinity to dragonflies, mainly because they're the fighter pilots, the fighter jets of the sky. They are incredibly agile. They have been basically the same for billions of years as far as their architecture. They are very well adapted hunters. In all cases of these hunters here, these are hunters that are actually attacking prey in the sky. They are moving, they're flying along, and they're attacking prey in mid-flight. So that's a pretty amazing ability. And boy, is it a pleasure to watch these guys hunt in any kind of a landscape. So those are our active hunters. Now, we also have sit and wait predators, and these are predators that are very well adapted with camouflage to help them basically just sit on a plant and wait for something to come to them. One of my favorite examples of this is the orchid mantis. This mantis right here that you see both on the top and this bottom photo here, is a flower mimic, and it mimics an orchid flower so that when organisms are coming to pollinate that flower or to receive a nectar reward, they get attacked by a mantis. And these are, smaller mantis, but very cool looking. And if you Google orchid mantis, you're going to get a real treat with all the diversity of orchid mantises that are out there and just how crazy they look when it comes to coloration. So that's one example is our orchid mantis. Another example of a sit and wait predator would be like our crab spiders. Spiders are really great predators. Spiders do not get enough credit for the role that they play in our landscapes as far as predators are concerned. Spiders are one of the most important predators that we have in agricultural landscapes. So the crab spider is a really great example because it just sits and waits, something comes along and it attacks it. So it's a sit and wait strategy. The other example are trapping organisms. And I mean, clearly the first one that would come to anybody's mind is a spider. Spiders, basically a lot of spiders, not definitely not all spiders, but a lot of web building spiders, what they are focused on is that web is a trap. They trap organisms in the web, makes them easier to catch. So these organisms have actually developed strategies for trapping things. Spiders are a great example, but one that doesn't get enough credit, and I always like to mention, are antlions. Antlions are these incredible predators of the forest. And generally, you see them in sandy soils, like here where I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We're on a sand hill, and we have tons of these around. Pretty much everywhere you see a downed log, there's going to be a series of these pits that you see next to them. And what this is this is a pit that this predator right here makes. The predator sits its butt right down at the bottom of it, and that pit is very loose sand. So any kind of an ant or insect that crawls on that berm right there, that outer edge of that tunnel, just falls right in, and that's where the antlion is waiting to predate on it. So another type of trap that predators will use to catch organisms. So these are examples of our predators and how they catch their prey. So those are the three ways that they do it. Parasitoids are very different. Parasitoids use an entirely different set of tools and strategies in order to find their hosts. They're not just randomly moving around a landscape and looking for things. What parasitoids are using is a very, very intuitive and intelligent way of finding other organisms. Let's go back to our tomato plant that we started with during this beginning of this talk. So our tomato plant is being attacked by a tomato hornworm. Now, we know from research, and this is a field of research that's known as chemical ecology, and this is my area of expertise when it comes to entomology, outside of beekeeping, is that plants and insects are not idle participants in the landscape. In fact, they're communicating with each other all the time. In fact, your plants do talk, and they talk to each other, and they talk to other organisms in the landscape. That is not something I'm making up. That is real. That is science, and they're doing it through chemicals. Plants and insects are masters of biochemistry. And so, what has happened over the course of the last, I'd say 35, 40 years in the field of this field of chemical ecology is that we have begun to understand that these organisms are communicating with each other. So, let's go back to our tomato plant. Our tomato hornworm attacks our plant. That plant has developed plant defenses and signals that it uses to notify people in the area that I'm being attacked. These are chemical signals. So these are actual volatile chemicals that are being emitted by the plant in a different concentration, or maybe they're novel chemicals altogether, than they would normally be expressed in a healthy plant. So once the plant starts to get consumed by an herbivore, it expresses this plume of smells that are different than a normal plant. We can think about these things as kind of like a call for help if we're trying to make it close to what a human would be doing in this situation. But the call for help is a chemical plume out into the air. And parasitoid insects have evolved in a way that they perceive these plumes of air, they follow these plumes of air, and they will track these plumes of air back to the plant that has been emitting them, and that is how they locate their prey items. It's not just random searching. It's not picking stuff out of the air. It is literally listening to the plants talking to them and them interpreting that signal and understanding that that means that there's a prey item attacking a plant. This is it is incredibly sophisticated language and something that we are just starting to understand as humans. And so this is a very new area of science. Again, chemical ecology. I encourage you to look up on it and start studying it. In my opinion, this is the next green revolution in agriculture. We're still quite a ways off, and we'll talk about some of the strategies that we're starting to see utilized here at the end. But this is kind of the next generation of pest management, and in my opinion, from a sustainable standpoint. All right, so let's talk about what is biological control. We've led up to all of this with talking about who these individuals are that we use as biological controls, or as we call them natural enemies. Now let's talk about what are the actual strategies that we use to incorporate these in a biological control program. So we're first going to start we're first going to start by talking about the idea that biological pest control is essentially the use of natural organisms to reduce pest populations. So we're using them as a mechanism to control pest populations. That's what we're after with biological pest control, is we're after controlling crop pests. Now, there's three strategies that we use to incorporate biological pest control. There's classical, there's conservation, and there's augmentation. And we're going to start with classical. The reason I'm starting with classical is because this is not the strategy you, as a farmer or a producer, is going to be using. Classical biological control is something that is done on a huge scale, meaning that these are releases of insects. I mean, we're talking billions of insects over huge areas, and typically classical biological control programs are things that are done by governments. They're essentially initiatives that are put in place because of a really bad problem that they can't get a hold of. And the example that I'm going to talk to you about tonight is the Vidalia beetle, which is what you see pictured here. And the reason I bring this up is because this is a story from my home where I grew up in Southern California, in the citrus producing region of Southern California, Redlands and Yucaipa, for those of you who are familiar with the area. So in the late 1800s, the citrus industry was centered in Southern California. There was the biggest citrus producing area of the United States. Florida had not really come online with huge citrus populations. And so not only was this the main citrus producing area, this is also the area where all of our fresh eaten citrus comes from. So most of the citrus produced in Florida is produced for juice. Most of the stuff that's produced in Southern California is actually the fresh oranges that we eat. So the Vidalia beetle was brought into the United States in the 1880s, specifically because in the 1800s there was a pest that emerged in this area of California called cottony cushion scale, which is the big white thing that you see here underneath this beetle. Cottony cushion scale at the time was an introduced pest that came from Australia. There were no natural enemies, meaning no predator insects. And this is where classical biological control really comes in, is classical biological control is usually utilized for invasive species. And that's not what we're generally dealing with as farmers. We do oftentimes, but again, this is something that's done at a very large scale. So this pest was introduced in the United States. It got to a point where in Southern California, the citrus crop, they thought we were going to lose it entirely. So bad that people were using things like arsenic and really gnarly chemicals just to get a handle on this thing. This cottony cushion scale was in an uncontrollable state. And what happened is that the state entomologist had this brilliant idea of going back to where this pest came from and actually searching for the organisms in its natural landscape that were eating it. And that's the Vidalia beetle that you see on top of that scale. The Vidalia beetle was introduced into California in 1888. And over the course of many years, the Vidalia beetle took hold and completely took control of cottony cushion scale. So much so that me as a kid working in these orchards, cottony cushion scale was not something we ever dealt with. And I saw this Vidalia beetle all the time working in these crops. So that's an example of classical biological control. It's something that's done on a massive scale, typically done by governments. With classical biological control, the other thing is that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once you release these predators, it's a very slippery slope because they may decide that they want to eat something different that's easier to eat, that's native. So there are usually usually a decade or more of research that goes into these classical biological controls before they're ever released into an area, because you have to do a lot of research to determine who they're eating, if they're going to eat someone that's a non-target, and all of these other things that go along with releasing a non-native predator in an area. It can go sideways really fast. So that's classical biocontrol. None of you are going to use it. What you are going to be using is conservation and augmentation. Conservation biological control is the idea that we incorporate habitats like flowering border strips to encourage more natural enemies, both providing them a food source and a coverage source. This example right here, this is a strawberry field, and what you see interplanted here is sweet alyssum, which is one of my favorite plants to put into any landscape for a biological control situation. Lacewings really love this plant. A lot of organism, a lot of your parasitoid wasps really love sweet alyssum. It's a super easy thing to sow, and very easy to incorporate in just about any landscape. So the idea here is you incorporate the flowers, and then all the natural enemies are attracted to the flowers and hang out in those flowering border strips and then browse in your crop where they're going into the crop to actually feed on organisms. The next one is augmentation. And augmentation is different from conservation, is that conservation, you're developing habitat to incorporate these natural enemies and to increase their population. Whereas augmentation, you're actually augmenting the population by adding natural enemies to it. And what you see here, this is a spider, this is a two-spotted spider mite control that's available through Copert. And basically what it is it's natural enemies in a bottle. And you basically go around and you just sprinkle your natural enemies all over your plants. And I spent years doing this stuff when I worked for nursery producers. It's a great way to augment the population. You're basically adding a ton of natural enemies all at once, and so you get a really good control over them. The difference here is that conservation and augmentation over the long term have kind of different effects. So let's talk about this in the next slide here. The biological control strategies for small farmers and gardeners. So let's start with augmentation, because augmentation is a short-term strategy. So for example, if you've got some crop pests that start to pop up and you start noticing them in higher amounts, this might be a good indication that you need to augment the population of natural enemies. The easiest way to understand this is like you buying, lady beetles in a dish from your local Ace Hardware. Now, that is a form of augmentation, but before, I'm telling you to go buy lady beetles and you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to buy a ton of lady beetles. Lady beetles and praying mantis are a couple of the worst biological controls that you can absolutely buy. So, number one, both of them are territorial. When you release lady beetles, their first instinct is to disperse. And so wherever you put them, unless it's in a greenhouse, they're going to leave pretty readily, right as soon as you let them go. Praying mantis will feed on each other, so not a good thing to be releasing those in high amounts. There are much better biocontrols other than those two that you can incorporate in your landscape. But essentially, what you're doing here is you're adding a whole bunch more predators to or parasitoids to your landscape by purchasing them. Now, the big thing here is that you can purchase these readily, and I'm going to give you a list of suppliers. However, it's not the biocontrol that tends to be expensive. These generally, a bottle of Spidex or something like that maybe cost you like 30 or 40 bucks, but everything has to be shipped overnight because these are live organisms and you're not something you can sit on. You get them, you deploy them. You don't get them and put them in the fridge and wait a week to deploy them. These are live organisms, so you have to move quickly and they get shipped quickly, which means that everything's overnight shipped, which shipping is very expensive for biocontrols. So depending on where you're at, that might be a factor. But this is a good strategy. Augmentation is something that is used a lot in the greenhouse industry. And the reason is because you have a closed environment. You can throw in all these biological controls and they're going to just obliterate your pest insect. And because they're in a controlled environment, you're not going to get them drifting off. If you have lady beetles in that situation, that would work well if it's in a controlled environment, like a high tunnel or something like that. Now, the one that most of you, and I always encourage everybody that's interested in this form of pest management, this is the way you should start, is conservation biocontrol. This is a long-term strategy. This is you incorporating plant species into your landscape that support natural enemies. And this is a strategy that just involves mostly just planting flowering plants. And I'm going to give you a list of what the good ones are here in just a moment. But that's really what it entails. So it's you being a good gardener, a good farmer, a good, steward of the land is adding biodiversity and flowering resources. Now, if you're one of those folks who, takes my beekeeping classes, Heroes to Hives, or one of the other classes I offer, this is a twofer. You're going to get natural enemy food, feed and coverage, and you're giving food to your bees, not only just your honeybees, but native bees as well. So this is a good strategy for everybody. Add more flowering plants. In addition, add more diversity of flowering plants. So you see, like in this picture here, this is begonias, irises, and then the border strip is all sweet alyssum and lobelia. So all really great plants, those lobelia and those sweet alyssum in particular. This area over here, you see you've got all these dahlias, you've got all sorts of diversity, but you see that architecture, the textures, the layers are very different within that landscape. And those are places for your natural enemies to hide. Those are places for them to be safe, for them to be able to procreate, all of those things. And so that shelter, in addition to the food resource, is like a twofer when it comes to natural enemies. If you are interested in, and especially if you're in Michigan, if you're outside of Michigan, this is a great list to start with. This is the E2973. If you just Google Michigan State University Extension E2973, this document will come up. This is one of my favorite documents. I share this with all of my beekeeping classes as well. This is a native plant list of beneficial plants that attract beneficial insects. And you see, you've got a list of 26 plants, and then they're scored based on the natural enemies. So you see, if it's 3 stars, it's a great for your natural enemies. If you see the next column is your bees, and then you can also score it for your bees. So if you're trying to do both, something like a cup plant gives you the best of both worlds. It's going to support both of those organisms. Things like goldenrod is another one that's going to support everybody. So these are really great plants to incorporate in your landscape because they're giving you the nutritional value you need for these natural enemies and the nutritional value you need for your bees as well. Check that document out, definitely. Again, the E2973 from Michigan State University Extension. Just put that in a Google search engine and this will come up, or you can use that link right there at the bottom. All right, let's move on. We're getting real close here to the end, folks. Thanks for hanging with me. All right, so increasing natural enemies to control crop pests. The easiest way to do this is flowering border strips. If you are producing any kind of a crop, whether it's a row crop, a specialty crop, a greenhouse crop, whatever, flowering border strips are by far the easiest thing you can do to support natural enemies. And they need to be diverse habitats. You see, like on the left here, we've got sunflowers, we've got anemones, we've got all sorts of different things in here. And it's very diverse. This is where your natural enemies are going to hang out. This is where the adults are going to feed if they're flower feeders, and then they move into the crop to attack your crop pests. Really easy strategy to do, and it looks beautiful too. Who doesn't like more flowers on their farm, right? All right, so we're going to wrap up today with talking about another strategy you can use to encourage natural enemies into your landscape. And this is like right on the cusp of the most, cutting edge research that we have in this area. And we're going back to this idea of plant defense, back to our tomato plant, our tomato hornworm, and that whole idea of this signal that they are sending out, the plant's sending out as it's being fed upon, asking for help from our parasitoid. So wouldn't it be awesome if we could actually talk to interject in this conversation that's happening here? So, do you speak plant? Have you maybe talked to an insect lately? There is a way that we can participate in these conversations. And this was one of the main areas of my research when I was working on my PhD was how can we maybe participate in this chemical conversation that's happening in this landscape between hosts and predators and parasitoids. We're targeting parasitoids here. So we're going to use my asparagus crop as an example. So this is my really great drawing of an asparagus crop using PowerPoint. So we've got asparagus and we've got an asparagus beetle. The asparagus beetle is a specialist pest on asparagus. It's a global pest. And basically what it does is it feeds on the asparagus and lays eggs. And it makes the asparagus unmarketable because the eggs can't be washed off easily and it feeds on the stems as well. So our herbivore is eating on this. Wouldn't it be nice if we could plant a lure on that crop well before predator or herbivores got out of control and actually just started calling in just tons of parasitoids? So if we deploy this lure and that odor came off of that and our natural enemies followed that odor, we essentially could, at any time we started to see high pest pressure, put a bunch of these lures out, and then all of a sudden we'd have all these crop parasitoids coming in to eat these crop pests. Now, this is not something that's just in research. This is a real thing. And so, what I want to also employ upon you that is available to you are predatory lures. This is a product called Predalure. It's from a company called AgBio, and this is an attractant for these insects right here. So we've got predatory mites, we've got lady beetles, we've got lacewings, syrphid flies, minute pirate bugs, and predatory wasps. So what you do is you essentially put this lure out on your crop, and it attracts these organisms in. You haven't used augmentative biocontrol. You haven't done conservation biocontrol. You are literally recruiting these from surrounding landscapes. And so that's where these lures really come in. There is also another available in the market known as Benelure, and that's from Gardens Alive. Very similar concept, attracts the same kind of insects, but again, is a predatory lure that is available to you. All right, that is wrapping up tonight. That's my contact information. If you've got any questions about this, this was recorded and will be posted to the Heroes to Hives YouTube channel later this week or early next week. So if you want to see that this a recording of it, that's where it will be available. And I'm going to wrap up with giving you a couple little examples of resources that you can use to actually learn more about this. So number one, this is a really great book that is very approachable for anybody. The Natural Enemies Handbook. This is put out by the University of California publication house. And it's a very highly illustrated guide to biological pest control. It gives you the theory behind it, some of the case studies, and a lot of the nuts and bolts about who are the good organisms and what they actually do. It's a really great book to check out. Another one is Good Garden Pests by Mary Gardner. Mary is a MSU alumni and was in I guess she was in the department a few years before I was, but she is an expert on biological control and predator and parasitoid insects. This is a very good book as well. I have both of these books in my own library. And again, kind of an introduction to who are your most common good garden bugs. And that's really where this comes in, is that you've got to really train yourself on the identity of these individuals, because what we'll talk about in February when it comes to scouting is part of scouting is knowing who you're looking at in order to make informed pest management decisions. Do I need to do something more severe than implementing a biological control? Do I need to use something like a pesticide, or am I at that point? So that's something to think about. The last thing I'm going to leave you with, and I would encourage you, if you are going to be shopping for biological controls, to take a screenshot of this or wait for the recording so that you can get this list out. These are the major insectaries in the United States and in Canada that are producing biological controls, meaning they're the ones that produce the augmentative biological controls that you purchase and then incorporate into your landscape. For those of you that live in Michigan, Copert is the best one for us. Copert is, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, the best biological control company in the world. They're based out of the Netherlands. I had a lot of experience working with Copert as an undergrad out at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, but they have a facility in Romulus, Michigan, which is one of their main insectaries in the United States. So if you're in Michigan or in the Midwest, they're a really good source because your shipping is going to be less. If you can drive there, you can pick things up from the insectary. So that's something to keep in mind with Copert. But all of these are good insectaries to use and something that you can rely upon as far as a source for these. But again, remember, if you're buying insects, live insects, everything's getting shipped next day air. So we'll leave that up here while I answer these questions, just in case you want to get anything off of that. And I have a couple questions here that we'll answer before we wrap up. Jolie asked, did you say Sweet Alyssum, the white flower annual, for a good, attractive flower? Absolutely. Sweet Alyssum is one of the best plants when it comes as a companion plant for biological controls. In fact, in California, in cabbage production, there was a bunch of research done with this specifically around the lacewing that we saw in these slides. And Sweet alyssum attracts a tremendous amount of lacewings, which are really good predators of things like cabbage white, which is a predator, or excuse me, an herbivore of cabbage. So yes, it is sweet alyssum that I'm talking about, and that is absolutely a dynamite plant. It is one of the landscape plants. It's also completely edible. It's one of the plants that people just don't give enough credit to, and it is by far one of my favorite plants to incorporate into a landscape as an annual. It can also be very easily established. I mean, I broadcast seed my sweet alyssum and then just rake it in. So because it's a very small seed, it doesn't have to get very deep, very easy to sow. Nicole said, a bit outside the scope, but do you recommend BT for caterpillar control? I worry about colonizing my soil since I don't know if it competes with other bacteria. No, BT is a fantastic bacterium to incorporate into this. And BT essentially dissolves the guts of caterpillars. It's a pretty specialized control and is excellent, especially for organic farmers. It is a really excellent bacteria. And really, I mean, Bacillus thuringiensis is just a fantastic organism to have in your landscape, and it doesn't compete with other good bacteria. This is something that is very highly specialized to Lepidoptera, which are your moths and your butterflies. Do you mean so Joel, you had another question. Do you mean cabbage white moth that lays eggs that turn into little green caterpillars and then eat brass? Yes, yes, cabbage white is that exactly exact one. It is the one that you see all over brassicas of all types. So yes, that is exactly what I'm talking about. And that is the one where if you incorporate sweet alyssum, it's going to attract those green lacewings, which are predators of those cabbage whites. You remember those green lacewings have those big clamping sickle part mouth parts. They hook right onto things, larvae especially. So they like juicy larvae like cabbage white. They grab onto those things, liquefy the insides, and suck it back out. Terry says, as a kid, I used to put two praying mantises together and watch them battle. Exactly. They are very territorial. So you put a whole bunch of them in one place together, they're just going to kill each other. All right. And Mark said, thank you. Very well done for the info. You're very welcome, Mark. And I appreciate y'all being on here tonight. I know we're getting close to the holidays, and I appreciate you taking the time to learn a bit about biological control with us tonight. If this was of interest to you, our Friday, or excuse me, our February, we're not going to do a January webinar, but our February webinar is going to be on scouting. And so we'll basically be kind of taking this to the next step, which is actually thinking about how do we take the information that we gather from looking at insects and turn it into something that actually makes sense as a control program for our farm. And so that's what we focused on next time. I appreciate all of you being here tonight, and I wish you and your families a very happy holiday season and happy new year. Thanks everybody for joining tonight.